Welcome to the Automoto Film and Art Festival's Storytellers Podcast. I'm Cam Benty. Today we have Harold Osmer, author of Where They Raced. It's a guide to racing in Southern California since the automobile was new. Welcome, Harold. Good to have you back on Storytellers.
Always good to be with you, Cam.
Absolutely. Well, today we're going to talk about speed, the essence of speed, the highest pinnacle of speed, Bonneville.
Bonneville.
You know something about that, I bet.
I know a little bit about that. And Bonneville is one of those things where you say Bonneville, nobody thinks, oh, that place I went hiking last summer with the family. No.
No, it's not just going to Salt Lake. But so where did all this begin? Where should we start on this topic?
Well, Bonneville was, well, of course, it's been there forever. It's an ancient lake
Yes.
bed.
Describe it for us. I mean, it's how big and what are we looking at?
Man, it varies because it is an ancient lake bed. It's up in northwestern Utah, right on the border between Utah and Nevada.
Right.
And it's just an ancient lake bed. And it's been dried out, and then it gets wet every year from the rains and whatnot, and it fills up to a level of about a foot or so, and then it dries out, and it's all high mineral deposits there, salt, and it gets very hard packed.
Well, it's kind of a resurfacing thing, isn't it? I mean,
is.
the water actually helps smooth the surface some, and then, of course, sometimes it doesn't leave, which is another whole issue we won't get into. But, so...
Well, you can see, the guys watching online, you can see there's a map up on here that shows where Salt Lake is, and Salt Lake City is just off to the right, and you're looking 80 miles, 100 miles away, and that's the lake bed, this big white spot. It's that huge. And this particular area where they drive the cars is more flat than others for whatever geographic reason that is. And so that's what they use for the speed trials.
Right. And the timing is over. It's a flying mile and then a turnaround.
Right.
So that's what they do currently. And how long is the section? Do you know how long the section is that they're using, Chris?
It always varies.
By year? It
varies because of conditions. Now, sometimes you have wetter years or drier years, this kind of thing. And in the way back days, they had virtually unlimited salt, let's call it, because there was no mining or anything going on at the time, so it was just as thick as could be.
Right.
And you had guys like...
there's some water right there. Huh?
Yeah. When it rains, you know. Teddy Tetzlaff was out there in 1914, for one, and... he drove 145 miles an hour in Blitzen Benz.
Wow. That's just an incredible speed.
In 1914, it was, they had the experts of the day were saying that you go over 60 miles an hour in a car, he said, you'll pass out. You won't get enough oxygen going that fast, and these kind of things. And they just didn't know.
Sure.
And eventually they did know. There's a good shot. Teddy Tetzlaff and the governor standing next to him.
This gentleman right here, is that Teddy?
Yep.
Very nice.
And the Blitzen Benz, you can get a good idea for how big that car is, chain driven and the whole thing. It was just an amazing time. Now, that was 1914. Tetzlaff was a Southern California guy, very popular here. He rode Santa Monica road races and Corona and things like that. So he was a race driver, and they found their way up there. They knew that the salt flats were there, and a variety of guys went up there in that same time period. If we start running down the list of names and dates and everything else, it'll just make us all crazy.
Right.
So Bonneville was a known entity. The racers from Southern California didn't really find it until the mid-30s. Mid to late 30s is when they started finding their way up there. And one of the reasons they didn't get that far up is because it is far. And you have to get your car there somehow. And most of the early hot rodders were just young guys.
Right.
And they were and this time we're talking in the mid to late 30s, there was a lot of old Model Ts laying around. And the guys would play with them and tinker with them and make them go fast on the street. And they would drive them to work and that sort of thing. And eventually, guys being guys, mine will go faster than yours. Well, no, it won't. Well, okay. And that's it. So eventually they found their way to Bonneville. What they did first was race on the city streets, which is dangerous today. It was less dangerous, 80 years ago.
Sure.
There was so much wide open space here in Southern California.
Right. So just to reiterate, 1914, very early, was that the first recorded Bonneville event? Was that the timing they started?
Yeah. So far as official timed events, things went on.
And today they run Bonneville every year, usually September timeframe, somewhere in there, depending again on the salt condition. But did they run every year back then?
No. It wasn't a regularly scheduled event.
I see.
It was special events. Let's see how fast. We're going to go set a new world record. And they were racing on the beach in England. They're racing on the beach at Daytona. They even had a land speed event at Pismo Beach. You just needed a big, wide, flat surface where the guys could run essentially flat out and then be able to measure that in some meaningful way.
Right. Southern California had the unique ability to go closer. In other words, El Mirage was in our backyard. And a lot of things happened at El Mirage that were pretty interesting as well that actually helped shape the Bonneville racing, if I'm correct.
Oh, absolutely right. And that's the high desert as opposed to the low desert. Low desert would be like Salton Sea, which is effectively sea level.
Right.
El Mirage, those places, Edwards Air Force Base, it is now, Muroc Dry Lake, that's 2,800 feet above sea level, hence the term high desert.
Right.
Well, but it was a close place. It was relatively flat, wide open, nothing to run into.
Was it salt?
No, mud.
Mud.
It's mud. So because it was a dry lake, even though the salt flats are a dry lake as well, but there's more minerals there, so you have more salt. At El Mirage, it's all mud. And you have to go, again, at certain times of the year, depending on the rain, because you can't drive on the stuff when it's too slick and that sort of thing. So you just time it out and you make it work that way. And it was close enough that guys could get to. And, Southern California guys could get to it relatively easy.
And they could test and tune up there and try their latest design and figure out how to go fast. But El Mirage started with there was a timing association that came about?
The early hot rodders they'd formed up groups and clubs and whatnot. You meet your buddy at work or the guys in high school that all got together and did their things, and you'd form up a club and call yourselves whatever you wanted to call yourselves. We're the Screwdrivers or whatever. The Roadrunners.
Roadrunners, yes. Screwdrivers, that's kind of an oddball. Sounds like a lot of maintenance involved with that one.
But so guys would do that, and then they would say, "Hey, we ought to go up and run at the lakes and do this." And so they would go up there on the weekend. We gather up our 4 or 5 cars and go up there and do this. Camp out for the weekend a whole bit. And it got to be too disorganized. I mean, it's fun to show up and just have your fun, but they needed some sort of organization amongst the clubs. And that's when the Southern California Timing Association, SCTA, came about. It was the leaders of several of the car clubs just said, "Hey, guys, look, we ought to coordinate this a little better." Number one, so that we all show up at the same time so we can compete with one another. It was a lot of rivalries, but it was friendly rivalries. It was all the guys coming together with this shared passion of trying to go fast. The other point was they needed to share information. Wait a minute. Did you port yours out, or did you put those other heads on, or did you change the firing order, or how did you tune that carburetor? All of this information was all gathered by sharing. It was brand new. Nobody knew anything about this except these guys, and they built it from that. So when SCTA came along in 1937 is when they formed up, they were able to get the community larger and bigger for that. And again, that was 1937, so they did that through the latter part of the 30s.
Right. Interesting. And a lot of those guys, I think I remember a lot of the manufacturers that created performance parts were involved with SCTA initially so that they could build parts that were, more uniform. Is that an accurate statement?
Sure.
And anybody in particular that you can think of?
Edelbrock is the big guy. Edelbrock Sr.
Right.
And many of these companies passed down through the years. Ed Winfield was another one who came along. Going fast in Southern California didn't start with the lakes. They were running on the real roads and at the board tracks and all these kind of things. So the speed industry had been around. This particular type of application was different, though.
Interesting.
And what happens is you get some really bright guy, we'll use Edelbrock Sr. as an example, who has some machining knowledge as well. Maybe he works in a gas station as a mechanic or whatnot, and he's looking at this and he thinks, I'm losing whatever it is, fuel pressure. Once I get to a certain RPM, maybe I should do this or that. And so he starts tinkering and playing, and he solves that problem. Once he solves that problem, he goes a little bit faster. And then somebody notices, I used to beat that guy. Now he's beating me. So they start looking at it. And Edelbrock, among others, is bright enough to say, I can sell you a couple of these parts. And if I can sell these parts, maybe I should make these parts and sell even more parts.
Right.
And that's helps bring about some of the standardization and the rules and whatever else.
Interesting. Were the rules that were created at SCTA used in Bonneville then? Were they carried over, or was there another group that was doing the rules for Bonneville?
They were adapted to Bonneville. They showed up there after World War II. And the first meet only had a few dozen cars show up because it was such a haul to get there. And you had to convince everyone to show up in the first place.
Sure.
It was so remote. And so they brought their rules, the regulations and everything, and brought it up there, and they ran on the course. And now you can run flat out. And one of the things that'll stun, it's obviously a bucket list sort of thing for auto racing guys. You have to go there at least once.
I've been there once.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and that's a good bucket list item for any auto racing fan.
Yes.
It's very different from anything else you see. You go to a standard racetrack and they have concrete walls and fencing and everything else. The fences at Bonneville are made of air. There is that much space.
There are none.
If your car gets out of control and has drama, it's going to stop before it gets anywhere near where anybody's standing. Right. And it's that stereotypical distance sort of thing that we used to see on Wide World of Sports sometimes, where you see this little dot running across the horizon with a little trail of smoke coming off, and that a distant sound. And that's what it would be.
Absolutely.
And it looks and sounds just like that. There
you go.
It looks like salt.
I think they're running here.
Yeah. It could just as easily be snow, except that it's if you get down on your knee and you stand up, you'll notice your knee is a little bit damp, not necessarily wet. And tastes like salt. Right. You don't want to eat a lot of it, probably kill you, but probably not.
Well, it's always good for a sunburn. I remember when I went, don't wear shorts and sunblock under your chin because the sun reflects right off the salt and shoots back up. So yeah, it's a good place to get a really good burn. After Teddy did his record, any other significant records that are worth noting in that early time with regards to Bonneville? Anything that comes to mind? Anything that was really impressive?
There were a whole lot of them, and they kept they kept developing a new category, let's call it, for doing it. So they would run endurance runs. Right. They'd lay out a big circle, and they would just drive in a circle and see how far could a guy go in 24 hours. This kind of thing. And they'd run day and night. They put out little smudge pots to light the circle for the guy, and he would just go in circles for 24 hours, time them out, call it a new speed record, this kind of thing. If you're creating categories for land speed.
Right. That's in Louise Noth's book, her Land Speed Louise, appropriately enough. There she is right there. Yeah, she's one of the lead, most knowledgeable people about Bonneville over the years, so we're lucky we have her. But I noticed the racing. There's a picture in her book about the smudge pots and going around the circle. But today there are so many classes for racing, and obviously the key for a lot of folks, as with drag racing or other categories where there are a lot of classes, finding a soft record and then going after it. And there are a lot of classes for up at Bonneville, and you can usually come back if you're looking for some of the higher end locations or classes. You probably would have some huge competition, but you can usually kind of slot yourself in. Oh, there's a nice day at the Salt. So what's that? 127?
That's about 127 right on the Salt. Looks like snow.
Yeah, sure does. It's not cold. It's not cold.
And this is a national park. So you can go there and just visit and drive on the Salt and visit as a national park thing. It's very remote.
Right.
And And it's astounding to go there and just see how big and wide open this is. And you can literally see to the horizon with nothing between you and there. Nothing grows there. There's no trees, no shrub bushes, no little pucker bushes, no nothing.
Right.
It's just flat as can be. Any bugs that you find are blown in from Idaho, that kind of a thing. And it's an astounding place. It is,
there's no grandstands.
Big as you've heard.
Yeah, no grandstands. Parked cars around the outside, and obviously there's a track, and they can go 7 miles. Am I exaggerating too much? Usually a 5 mile standing mile.
At some point,
standing 5. Yeah.
Okay, I was the announcer up there for a couple of years, and
that had to be interesting.
And it was a fascinating time. And the best way at that time, we had 4 courses running, and the best way I found to describe them is if you hold out your hand and tuck in your thumb, spread out your fingers. Now, your pinky finger is the track or the course that is more to the south, and that was the short course, which SCTA used to train the drivers. They're going to make sure that you can control your car at 100 miles an hour. Then they want you to do it again at 150 miles an hour, this kind of thing, just to see, make sure. And that was the training course, so it was the short one. The ring finger would be the next course, which I think at this time was 2 miles long. And so you get up to speed, and then over that last mile is where they measure you as from the beginning to the end of the measured mile, they call it, even though the course is 2 miles long. The next course, I think at this time was 3 miles or 4 miles long. And again, you have that run-up time, that first mile or so, it's the run-up time, and then they measure you after that, between the measured miles, between the 1 and the 2 and the 2 and the 3 and the 3 and the 4, this kind of thing. The long course would have been your index finger. And I think when I was there, it was 5 miles long.
Okay.
And so you get that same kind of thing where you're running the measured mile. So that term comes up periodically.
Right.
They generally will push start you, and off you go, and you're on the course by yourself. And again, the way it worked, they had a kind of a generalized starting area, which would be the palm of your hand, and then the courses fanned out as they went down. Depending on the weather conditions throughout the year, that determines how long the course can be before it starts getting soft or the salt gets thin or they can't safely grade it out, because that's how they would mark the course or prepare the course. As the salt dries, it cracks and everything else, but they drag a big grader over it. And so they would drag the courses to smooth them out. And that served a number of purposes, even aside from just going fast. It also helps with any forensic activity should a car crash, because there's nothing out there. It's all white and smooth. And if a car has drama, they go out and they walk that path, and they can see where the car went. They can see where, there's a bolt right here, and they map it out. They carefully map it out. SCTA officials do that. They map it out. They say, here's this, here's that, and here's these, and they can gather up all the parts and clear everything away. So it works out in that regard as well.
Interesting. Well, the cars are so different. That's the other thing. We talked about the different classes. Hand in hand with that is obviously the different styles of how to go fast. Different size engines, turbos, supercharged, all those other technical details that we won't go into. But it's fascinating. It's quite the car show. There's a lot to look at, and you can walk pit to pit. There's nobody's stopping you. Obviously, don't get in the way, but there are so many things going on at any one time, which is terrific. It's really fun.
It's SCTA is an amateur organization.
Right.
It's all volunteers, and they police themselves. They've been at it a long time. In many cases, it's multi-generational. And from the very early days, you got your Model T versus my Model T. Okay, that's easy to determine. Well, you just changed your engine out. That's hardly fair. Okay, so we have to call your car something different than mine because I'm going to race with Model Ts and you're going to race with the hopped-up Model Ts or however it works.
Right.
And so they needed to decide how we're going to regulate this, because it's not fair for one guy to compete against another. And the one guy doesn't need to compete against the other. He's still out there having a good time.
Well, that started with the guys at El Mirage, did it not? I mean,
Yes.
and a very interesting guy, and a guy that I knew, Wally Parks, who also founded NHRA, and that's another evolution of what we're talking about here. But it was Wally who started SCTA, correct, with some of his friends?
Wally was involved in the SCTA. He did he published the newsletter for them. Again, this was in the 30s. And then through the 40s, he was involved in going up to Bonneville as well. And he saw a need for the racer who was at home and doing things. And so that's where the drag racing thing came about. He approached the SCTA about that. He said, hey, guys, we should control these drag racing things too. We could do this. And SCTA said, no, we're land speed guys. We're ultimate speed guys. We don't even want to mess with that other stuff. Because the drag racing didn't even have a name yet. And I think it was Wally Parks mentioned drag racing early in his writing career.
He was the editor of Hot Rod.
Yeah. And I think the term drag racing came about because the cars in the city would run on the main drag, because that would be, again, like with the salt, where you would drag a thing to smooth it out. The main drag, typically a dirt road in main town, your town, USA.
You bet.
Would be dragged smooth because it would be dirt, so it would be rutted and whatever else. Well, you want to race your car on the smoothest, longest thing, typically main street, main drag. Drag racing probably evolved from that. I don't know that anyone can point directly to it, but that's my story. I'm sticking to it.
That sounds good. But the thing that was interesting, Bonneville was a rolling start. They did not have to dig in, and especially when you saw some of those early cars from the 30s, they'd all go at the same time. There were 2 or 3 cars that would go at the same time, and they would be a rolling start to get going. Drag racing is from standing start, and usually it's a quarter mile. Today, for the top end, it's 1,000 feet, which is a situation because they started going way too fast. But and NHRA is also one of the brainchilds of Wally and others, correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And the rolling start was acceptable because we had plenty of room. And the cars, we talk about how fast these guys were. Well, it was comparatively fast. They were running, if you got it over 100 miles an hour with your T-Speedster with the Rajo heads and, whatever else, you're really doing something. And it was, no doubt about it, because they didn't know any better. They didn't have anything more. And if you tried to do it today in that same vehicle, you'd find out that was a big deal. As the cars got faster and more competitive, they realized that we shouldn't run them side by side, because the initial way was you would qualify in your time group if you can run 70 to 80 or 80 to 90, 90 to 100 kind of thing. They'd break you down by those groups. And then you'd run 3, 4, sometimes 5 abreast, all with a rolling start. Then everybody gets on the gas, and ultimately we'll find out whose car went the fastest, because we're all out there at the same time, side by each, going along. And you would get there, and okay, that's that. And that's how they would determine the winner. Later, they decided it was safer, especially because the cars started getting faster, and to just run individual, and then you run against the clock. Right. Which was the other way, or the other issue they faced was, how do we even measure this time? It started out with just a stopwatch. Well, there's all that thumb time inherent in the problem there. Sure. Otto Crocker is a guy who came up with the timing system that they run. And if you go to Bonneville this year and watch them, they'll go out and they lay out, they physically measure each mile. They got the clocking system. It's all digital now, and it works out really well. But back then, they had to develop all these rules, they had to establish, how do you determine who gets on the track, who doesn't get on the track? They used to have a single course. When I was there, we had 4. It used to be you'd have 1, which means everybody's in line and waiting, because that guy goes, they don't start another one right after it. No, they wait until that guy is all the way down the course and all the way off the course. Then you can run the next one. And so it was not uncommon to be there for the entire weekend and maybe get 3 passes, because it's, the line is too long. Right. And if there's ever any drama, everything stops until that gets cleaned up. We understand that. And then once that's out of the way, then we can start going again. Right. And some guys, if you're going to go 3 miles at 62.745 miles per hour,
it can take you a couple minutes.
Take you a little while.
You bet.
And everybody else is sitting in line waiting, and so there you go.
So who made the conversion from Bonneville to drag racing? Were there any particular heroes that made that change? They raced at Bonneville, or did they always start at drag racing because it was closer and more convenient?
There was some crossover. The cars were very different, though. Drag racing got going on the old air bases, World War II air bases that were retired. Like Santa Ana was the first official NHRA drag race in 1950. And that's only a set length. And early on, you had a little bit of a rolling start, and you had a flagman up there, and that's how they took off. Eventually, they got to where you started from a dead stop to go the distance. They decided the quarter mile was the best distance in Ramona, at the Ramona Airport down by San Diego. And what they did was they got a couple of the top cars of the day. They went out there. Mm-hmm. Wally Parks may have been amongst them. Stood out there and they just accelerated the car, get up as fast as they thought they could go, and then shut it down and see how much distance was required for that, to do it safely. And they decided a quarter mile was the proper distance. As you mentioned, they changed it now to 1,000 feet for the same reason, because the car's going too damn fast. The guys at the top are going way so fast, we need more room to stop, and we only have X amount of drag strip to do this in.
Over 300 miles per hour these days.
Oh, man, you get right on it.
Right.
And the technology had to evolve to do that. So the car that was successful at the lakes wasn't necessarily successful at the drag strip, because it's two different types of things, like a road racing car versus a sprint car, this kind of thing. It's two different classifications totally. And the technology had to evolve. Now, there was a lot of cross-pollination, no doubt about that. But things like, I need more power. So I make a more powerful engine, and I got all this power, and I hit the gas, and my transmission blows up. Okay, now I need a better transmission. Okay, now I get my transmission really strong. Okay, well, now I need more power to utilize all this. And one would get better, then the other would catch up, and the other would get better, and all these developments came along. When Garlitz was sitting in the hospital and he decided I should put the engine behind me instead of in front of me, these kind of things. Right. It took time. And boy, if you get into motorcycles, go through the SCTA rule book here, and you'll find gazillion categories for motorcycles. There's a sidecar guy here, and all these guys show up. You touched for a minute about the different kind of characters involved. People come to Bonneville from all around the world because it's a singular type of event. And it's the kind where there are rules, there's some regulations, and the SCTA is very good about explaining all of that to you. And they're very stringent in their rules and the way things are designed. When a car crashes at Bonneville, typically the car and the driver survive because of how stout everything is. One of the steps in the process, when you show up for the meet, is you get all your gear on, you climb into your car, you put all the seat belts and whatever else in there, make sure all your buttons and switches are where they need to be, fire extinguishers, whatever else. And then you've got 30 seconds to get out of your car on your own. And they'll stand right there and watch you. They'll say, okay, go. And that's where a stopwatch comes into play. And they watch you get out of the car with all your gear on, because it's up to you.
Fascinating.
You're going to crash. Guys are going to come and help you out. But for those first few critical seconds, you need to know, where's the release? Do I have room enough to get out of here when my helmet is on? Because a lot of times you get in your car, then you put your helmet on, these kind of things. They make sure that you can do that. And part of that is the training that SCTA does for their drivers. They are well-practiced amateurs, as it were. They've been doing this a long time, so they got a fair idea of what they're after. And the inspection team can pretty much look at your car and say, that won't work, this will work, change that to this. And it's all very helpful, because on the salt, it's not you versus me. It's you and me against the clock.
Right.
And everybody understands that.
You bet. Any interesting stories? Obviously, you said you were an announcer in Bonneville. Anything that stands out from your time doing that? Anything that was a great story that comes to mind, or an interesting character that you met while you were there?
There were so many characters, and I'm not going to name a whole bunch of names because I would just get lost in the mix of it. And then, mind you, it was 8 years ago, give or take. But when you're out there, everybody just spreads out and they do their own thing. Now, some guys have been going out long enough that I'm going to camp next to you because that's how it goes. Something that was fairly common was a guy would come by the announcer booth and hand me a little piece of paper and says, hey, car 1067 over there on the southwest end of the pits is looking for a fuel pump that'll do this and that and whatever. So if you got one, next thing you know, I'll get a note for, hey, car 1067 is real happy that these other guys brought him a fuel pump, these kind of things. Because, again, it's not you versus me. It's us against the clock. You get a number of characters that are always going to go fast. Poteet is one of them,
He's got the new the Speed Demon car that he's been running for a little while.
And
I'm familiar with that. Yeah,
real quiet, unassuming guys like Seth Hammond is another guy who shows up, and it's a family organization. Oh, there you go. That's Seth Hammond's car.
Wow, that's beautiful.
It's astounding.
Yes.
And the guy comes out and runs his car every year. He drives it. His wife drives it. His daughter drives it, the whole thing. So you have these guys. Then you get the other guys who have, we saw a Pan Carrera car, a big old Buick or whatever it was, and they just kept making pass after pass after pass. And the old guys were mad at them because, that's not what it's about. We're supposed to be out here going as fast as we can, blah, blah, setting records. These guys didn't care. They were just going fast because they could. They thought it was neat to do this.
They're touring the racetrack.
Sure.
Okay.
And then we had sprint car guys showed up when I was there. Damian Gardner, and he's a champion sprint car driver. No doubt about that. Top guy in the South here. And he showed up with a sprint car to run down Bonneville. First thing he had to do was take the big fat tires off, because big fat tires will affect your aerodynamics as you go down the course. And so here's a good shot of him. This is at the dry lakes. You can tell this is lakes because of the way the surface is.
This would be like El Mirage. That's right. The surface we're looking at. Okay.
And so, sprint cars got a lot of power and no weight. As you get up to speed, the car starts to float a little bit. So they kept having to add weight to the car. Well, at the end of one of the days, because they put the sprint car up, and I didn't know he was there, but as soon as I saw it show up on my screen, I recognized this name. Wait, he's running a sprint car. This is nuts. He's the only one that was out there, too, so it stood out for me. And they ran, and they were trying to go 200 miles an hour. He got about 190 and then spun. Most just did a flat spin, which most cars will go to a flat spin, and then they get off the course, and then that's how it goes. And he kept doing that. And then he would come back out again and run. And normally the Lakes guys will make a pass in their car, and then they might make one more pass that day, or they'll just take it in the pits and work on it and do stuff. And then they'll come back the following day and do it again. And this goes on for, it can be a week long. It's speed weeks. So you get a whole week out there. These guys kept coming back and doing it again and again and again. I finally started kind of joking with them a little bit because I understand, I speak sprint car. And then at the end of the day, I go walking through the pits, and everybody's very amicable. They're all friendly. Hey, how you doing? Yeah, I'm the announcer guy. Do you need anything? Let me know. This, hey, man, you're doing a great job, and all these kind of things. It's wonderful. I got down to the sprint car guys, and all you saw was assholes and elbows. They were working away on this car. They're doing stuff. And I stood there for about 10 minutes, and nobody talked to me. Nobody. And I'm watching this. Okay, sprint car guys, yeah. So the next day, sprint car came up on the screen, and I said, I went down there and tried to talk to these guys. They wouldn't talk to me, blah, 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 blah. And I was just ragging on them a little bit. I said, they'll come around. And sure enough, he made his pass. Next thing you know, they were in the booth with me. Hey, how are you doing? I said, look, it's different here. You're not racing. You don't have to be this competitive in that way. Everybody's open. Ask folks. They'll tell you. And later, Damian explained to me, he said, yeah, one of the things they kept telling me I had to add weight, and I thought they were nuts. I thought they were trying to slow me down. He said, And they finally figured it out, and it was great. It was fun to come around with them, and every time I see them at the racetrack, at Paris or Ventura, we still remember. We just wave. So that was one of the more fun, interactive type of things that we had.
Because sprint cars don't generally run 190 miles an hour.
No,
That's not an area where they're as the aerodynamics of a potato chip. Just whoosh,
yeah, and that short wheelbase makes it very difficult to keep in a straight line.
A big handful of car there.
That affects the roadsters and the streamliners and everybody else as well, too.
Right.
We're not going 120 miles an hour on the I-15 headed for Vegas. Oh no, you're on a very smooth, slick surface, and you're going almost 200 miles an hour. And
wasn't that the genesis of the dragster with the long wheelbase and the more stability, and then of course the big tires in the back? Because Bonneville, you don't need big tires in the back. You're doing a rolling start, but in drag racing, traction and suspension and transmission are all very critical. So it's an interesting deal. So in terms of drag race tracks sprung up because obviously they used, as you mentioned, airports, which was great, but it was also a way to get kids off the street. There was that whole orientation that street racing, as opposed to drag racing, became a problem, certainly in urban areas. You get Big Willie and that whole story that we won't go into, but obviously there was merit behind having drag strips around. But what was the first, we're talking about these airports, what was the big thing that happened with drag racing initially? So they ran at Santa Ana. What followed that? What happened after that?
What happened was, you've always got a steady supply of young men willing to risk their neck because it's just fun. I'm showing off for you, and we're showing off for the girls, and we just love doing this. We're living life. We're doing our stuff, and we should be. And so that's what's going on. And a lot of times the outlet for mechanically minded people, especially after World War II, a lot of these guys have been risking their necks for a reason they didn't fully understand. They could appreciate it, but maybe they didn't understand it as much. Well, now they can come back and just enjoy this kind of thing. Plus, when they went away to World War II in particular, the SCTA kept producing their newsletter, and the magazines would still come out. So the guy that's overseas can sit around and say, yeah, man, when I get back, I tell you, man, my roadster will do this and that, whatever else. And so that was one of the ways they could connect with home and stay involved in the world. Their real world was much more dangerous. And so they were anxious to come home and do this. And once they did, they found this as their outlet, as their way to go. And in keeping the drag strips and the organization for that local, it made it easier for us to get to. It made us easier for us to put forth the time, the effort, the money in creating something that we can go use instead of once a year hauling it up to Utah or going up to the dry lakes kind of thing. And with drag racing, it was very popular. There was a lot of culture at that time, especially in Southern California. Population was expanding, growing. There was a lot of industry here. The aerospace industry was going big. So a lot of guys had this technical training as well. So and all these pieces tie together. And as I'm talking with you here, I'm struggling to find the single thread that brings them together because there's so many pieces to it that all just had to coalesce at that one time. Right. And to some extent, we still have that today. I used to laugh about the green-haired guy in his souped-up Honda. He has every bit as much passion as that guy from the 50s who was tuning that carburetor on his old V8 60. He's just as into it. He's just as passionate about it. He has the same general goal. All these kind of things. It just changes generation to generation. That passion remains the same.
Yeah, that makes sense. The other thing that I'll throw in, just because I know about it, is that the magazine business was great at sharing information. You could find different things out in the magazines, which was Wally Parks at Hot Rod and Mr. Peterson, who started Hot Rod back in '48. So as soon as the war ended, a lot of these things happened. But that shared information created quite the audience, and a lot of magazines were dedicated to drag racing. Carcraft. I was the editor of Carcraft at one time. But I love all this information. I didn't know half of what you told me here with regards to that, and I was in the middle of it.
Well, if you go out there, the experience of this guy is different from the experience of that guy. So that guy's story is different from this guy. And that's part of the fun of anything that you do to get out of the house. You get out of the house, you go do something, all of a sudden you're living your life. You're having more fun. And if you can have a modicum of risk involved, it makes it even more real to you. You remember that. You remember the car crash you got into and survived. The one you almost had, you don't remember as well. And there's reasons for that.
But it's a good story, and you end up trying to embellish it with physical mannerisms. But yes, it's all very exciting, and it's very personal. And the feeling of speed it's an addiction. It really is.
And it's a shared experience. We're out here for the whole week. We're doing our thing. We only get together once a year. And that team with the diesel truck from Australia, the salty box, they're right over there with the big black truck. That's great. And we see them. We see our mates just once a year out here, and they've made the trek to come up here, and we see them. And nowadays, of course, email and the whole thing makes it simple for everybody to communicate this way. In the way back days, you didn't have that so much, So now these guys come from all over the country, all over the world, to come out for the singular events at Bonneville. And there's a couple of groups that run out there. SCTA, I think, is the largest one, and they're still largely a club. The way it works, I'll touch on this. The way it works is you look at your class, whatever classification you're in. Say you're a gas roadster, and the record for the gas roadster is 202 miles per hour. And I say, okay, you come out and you run. You go 204. Okay, cool. Then they take your car back around to the impound lot, and it sits in the impound lot, and they just guard it overnight. You can do maintenance and general things, but you can't change the engine. You can't do anything dramatic like that. The following morning, they take all the cars that wound up in the impound lot, and they let them go first. And you have to back up your run. And so you come out and you go 204.5. Okay, now you got the record at 204, whatever your average is there. And that's how they do it. And
what is the percentage that they have to back it up by?
They just have to.
Is it like 1-2%, that kind of thing?
1% or 2%.
Okay. All right.
But if you think of the world land speed record kind of thing, you always have to run it once, and then you have to duplicate the run just to show it wasn't a fluke.
Right. They run them back.
Exactly. They would run up, and then they would come back. And one of those reasons was because in the early days, he had the wind at his back, so you would go faster doing, this kind of. Right. So you'd have to drive all the way to the one end, turn around, and in a set amount of time, you'd come all the way back. Right. Well, SCTA doesn't have the luxury of being able to wait for the guys to come back. So they send everybody down, then they collect all the guys that want to run again in the morning for the record. You don't have to run for the record if you don't want to. Then they put them in the impound lot, look after the cars, and then they run them again in the morning. And the air is cooler and more dense in the morning.
Right. Better time.
So we're
fluctuations,
all in the same boat here. And then if you break a record, a certain percentage again, over 200 miles an hour, you get inducted into the 200-mile-an-hour club. You get the red hat, a very real thing, a red hat, and they'll let you wear a T-shirt that says 200-mile-an-hour club, and wear it with pride for the rest of your life.
Aren't there clubs at each point? Isn't there a 300-mile-an-hour and a 400-mile-an-hour? A little harder to get into, of course.
A little harder.
But look at how unique each vehicle is. I think that's maybe the charm of both drag racing and Bonneville, that there are just different ways of thinking about things, and people all of a sudden say, this is better, I'm going to build this car, which makes for good times. I remember seeing the land speed cars seem to get the highest they get the biggest headlines. We've got the Speed Demon car of George Poteet. I remember in '71 going to the New York Auto Show, and there was the Blue Flame that had gone 622 miles per hour that nobody was ever going to beat. Well, that's not the case. And wheel driven versus rockets. Oh, you can get into all the details and all the nuances, but I really have found this really fascinating, really interesting. Harold, did we miss anything? Is there anything you want?
There's so many strings out there to try to wrap it all up. One of my favorite quotes from a book by Dean Batchelor, who was there in the beginning when they first did it.
That could be Dean right there.
That could be.
Never know.
And he explained in there, he says there were great rivalries between the car clubs, the Chevy versus Ford guys, sedans versus coupes, this kind of thing. He said, but it was a friendly rivalry. He said, it was a great time. I wish you could have been there. In the middle of his book, you can just see it jumping off the page at you. I wish you could have been there. And that's how much it meant to him. Yeah. And it's how much it means to a lot of these people that go out there every single year and do this.
Well, this has been fascinating, a real slice of American history and speed, just the essence of speed, what draws us to these kinds of competitions. Well, Harold, thank you very much for being on Storytellers, and we'll have you back soon.
I look forward to it, Cam.
Thanks for joining us on the Automoto Storytellers podcast. Remember to subscribe, like, and share this episode and any others that you view. Thanks for joining us.